You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast with George Galloway.
And this is London, and this is a Yorkshire tea mug. Cue for the snowflakes to go crazy. Actually, there's only water in it. Well, thanks to the wonders of the internet, of course, I'm broadcasting to you throughout the entire world. So it's my duty to tell you that it's going to be quite grueling because we are dealing with some of the existential challenges now facing the international community. Let me start in the Levant. And let me start by putting my cards on the table. I have been proud to stand by the Syrian Arab Republic against the dozens, scores of countries who sought to destroy it and put ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their local affiliates in the alphabet soup of Islamist extremism into power in Damascus. I would have been proud of my stand even if we'd lost. I'm even more proud that we have won. Except we haven't won everywhere. The holdouts of ISIS and Al-Qaeda are living under Turkish and American protection in the Idlib province and one or two other scattered outposts. There are maybe 500 or so American forces there who put themselves between the Syrian Arab Army and its Russian ally and the final defeat of these head-chopping, heart-eating extremists. I put my cards on the table too that I'm on the side of Russia in this conflict. Not because I work for Russia Today, I was on that side before I did work for Russia Today. And in any case, I have never taken the view that I have to reflect the political positions of my employers, and RT has never asked me to do so. But I believe, and here I address those critical of the fact that Russia has not yet gone to all-out war with Turkey, that Russia somehow is too conscious of its geopolitical position, its overarching conflict with the United States, that somehow they're faltering in their duty to their ally, Syria. I'm with Russia. Russia is an international superpower, a multiply nuclear-armed superpower, and cannot go lightly into war, all-out war, with a member of NATO. And those of you demanding that she should are being at best unrealistic and at worst decidedly ungrateful, because if it wasn't for Russia, the black flags of ISIS would already be flying in Damascus. But there's no point in hiding the fact that it may come to all-out war. It's already all-out war between Syria and Turkey. Right now, this minute, this hour, there is all-out war between Syria and Turkey. And given that Syria's indispensable and close ally is Russia, the possibility of that becoming ineluctably a conflict which draws in Russia against Turkey, then Turkey triggers its NATO provision to bring in the other NATO powers on its side in that conflict. We could be looking at World War III. Now, some of you think that that is an exaggeration, but let's just look at what's happened in the last 24 hours. Turkey launched a devastating missile attack, not on Idlib, but on Latakia. Latakia is a very important city in Syria, and it's not the least important because it's full of Russians. It's a Russian naval and air and land base inside the Syrian Arab Republic. Now, we don't know yet because everyone has an interest in playing down what the impact of that attack on Latakia was, but it's highly likely that assets of the Russian Federation and members of the Russian military, the Russian Air Force, the Russian Navy, or the Russian Army Special Forces who are there were damaged in that attack. In the last 24 hours, thugs from the Turkish regime broke into the houses of my colleagues at Sputnik News in Istanbul, dragged them off to a fate uncertain, arrested the editor of Sputnik in Istanbul. These are grave provocations to Russia, which you may recall already lost its ambassador to Turkey to a cowardly assassination from behind in the back of his head whilst opening an art exhibition just a couple of years ago. Seizing Russian assets in Istanbul, seizing journalists who work for one of those assets, namely Sputnik, is a very grave provocation indeed. And Russia, if I'm any judge, and I'm not speaking for Russia, but if I'm any judge, Russia will not take these provocations lying down. And so the real possibility exists of a rattling down fast by the hour of the situation in Syria. Now, at this moment, there is a meeting scheduled for the 5th of March between Erdogan and President Putin. Erdogan's attitude, the rhetoric, and above all his actions don't indicate to me that a solution is going to be found easily on the 5th of March. And if it isn't found, then this situation may rapidly deteriorate into the most devastating of wars. There's war in India, where the scoundrel Narendra Modi is presiding over exactly the same kind of anti-Muslim pogroms as he presided over when the governor, chief minister of the province of Gujarat, which was such a performance as to have him banned from visiting both the United States and Britain. That was all forgotten about when he became the Prime Minister of India. It's all about the Benjamins, you know. It's all about the filthy lucre. And India, as a great country, as a great market, as a great center of profit for international companies and their governments, had to be given a pass. Modi had to be allowed to travel in a way that he was not hitherto. And his RSS Hindutva fanatics, based on the German Nazi Party, I'm not making that up, neither am I exaggerating, by their own words and actions, they have modeled themselves on the brown shirts of Hitlerism, are now openly cascading their sectarian hatred all over the capital city of India, and it's estimated that 500 Muslims have been set upon, have been burned alive, have been hacked to death, and a state of crisis now exists inside India. And I'll be talking later in the show much more about Mr. Modi. It's war on the coronavirus. Some people think that this is all an overreaction. One of them is our editor, who's written a piece which directly contradicts my own view on the issue. That's fine. This is a university, after all. I'll read you his piece, and then I will answer it. One way or another, this crisis, either because it is being overreacted to, or because it is an existential threat, especially to people in a certain demographic, poor, old, weak, already in poor health, is potentially devastating, contains within it the possibility of the death of millions of people. Already many thousands are dead, and new cases are erupting all over the world with a very serious effect. Now, right at the beginning of this crisis, I talked to you about how China had reacted to it. I praised China for its reaction, and I still praise China for its reaction. but I condemn those that didn't use the time won for them by China's swift and decisive action in order to better prepare their own populations and their own health services for dealing with this disease when it inevitably spread. This virus spreads, well, like a virus. 35 new cases in Britain just today. Hundreds of cases in Italy. Hundreds, maybe thousands of cases in Iran. Thousands of cases in South Korea, none yet in the north of Korea. There are people dying as we speak of the coronavirus. Now, some may say, well, they die of other things. They die of flu in huge numbers every year. But it's my view that the lethality of the coronavirus is much greater than the lethality of ordinary flu. There's a vaccine that you can take to try and stop yourself getting flu. There is as yet no such vaccine for coronavirus. And the percentage of people who die when they get this coronavirus is higher than those who catch ordinary flu. I'm hoping, although I travel, and I'm due to travel to places where they're currently quarantining thousands of people. I'm hoping to avoid it. The only question is, what price are we prepared to pay? What price are Liverpool supporters prepared to pay? What if the Premier League closes down this year's Premier League Championship because it's already been announced by the World Health Organization that people over 60 should avoid crowds? Well, I'm over 60 and I was in a crowd. I was even in an airplane today, albeit wearing for the first time in my entire life a mask over my face. Was I overreacting? You can tell us, by the way. That's our first poll this evening. I'll give you the question in just a minute. And it's war in the Democratic Party in the United States. All pretense has been abandoned. Elizabeth Warren, who's come fourth and fifth in every contest so far, has just openly admitted she's only staying in the race in the hope that it reaches a deadlock brokered convention in the summer, and that the grandees of the Democratic Party hand the nomination to her, even though she's the fourth or fifth choice of actual Democrats in the country. There's no doubt at all that they're attempting to steal it from Bernie. And Joe Biden, although he won in South Carolina quite decisively, is not likely on Super Tuesday to fare particularly well. Indeed, all the polls suggest that the Super Tuesday result will make Bernie unstoppable unless cheated, that he will have a plurality of the delegates, such a plurality as cannot be defeated, but will not have an overall majority. And if he doesn't, it is the intention of the others to steal it from him. I actually had such a thing. In 1982, I stood to be the Labour candidate in the Rhondda Valley in South Wales. I got more nominations than all of the other candidates put together. So all of the other candidates came together and kept me off the shortlist. So I recognize in a small way what Bernie is facing in the Democratic Party. Rania Khalek, the journalist, presenter and writer, has a huge following on social media, a great deal of interest in her analysis, both of American politics and politics in the Middle East. And I'm glad to say Rania Khalek joins me now. Rania, thank you very much for coming on the mother of all talk shows. Very nice to meet you at last. I've followed you for years.
Yeah, right back at you. It's really good to be on. And of course, I followed you for years as well and have always been a fan.
Thank you.
So it's exciting to be on.
Rania, let's start in the US, because I want to ask you something about the foreign policy attitudes of the Democratic Party nominees. would it be fair to say that Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard form one pole, if you like, a pole that is decisively against current American foreign policy, particularly Gabbard, though she can afford it because she's not really in the running to win the race. Sanders could do better, but is pretty good by comparison with other candidates in this field or in previous fields. But that Biden and Warren, for that matter, represent business as usual. And the other also-rans are probably creatures of the deep, if you get my drift. Would that be a fair characterization? Describe how important or not foreign policy is in this current race.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. And yes, that's pretty much true. Of course, like you mentioned, there is a slight difference between Gabbard and Bernie Sanders. I think Gabbard is definitely to the left of Sanders on foreign policy. And also she's made foreign policy and ending wars and ending regime change wars a centerpiece of her campaign. Whereas Bernie is, of course, focused more on the domestic. But of course, he's saying some what would be considered in the U.S. radical things about foreign policy that would really shake up the way things work now. But yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate in many ways that foreign policy doesn't play a larger role in the campaign because we don't hear about it as much. Because, you know, one of the reasons that Hillary Clinton won in 2016, the states that everybody was shocked that Trump won, one of those reasons is, you know, there was a study done that found a correlation between people who voted for Trump in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Ohio being like areas that have a high disproportionate number of military veterans and being people who are disillusioned by our endless wars. And they saw Hillary Clinton as the more hawkish candidate. So I do think that foreign policy could play a really big role in the election if it was made into a bigger deal, because there is a significant portion of even the Trump voting public who voted for Trump because he in many ways campaigned on disrupting America's endless war foreign policy, even though he didn't follow through on that.
Now, since Bernie was fingered as a Russian asset, a Cuban fan, a Fidel Castro fan, and so on, he has slightly gone into retreat, hasn't he? Instead of saying, enough of your games, there's no Russian help in my campaign, and instead of standing up to those accusing him, to me, he's done a bit of a Jeremy Corbyn and started to run away from it. Am I being unfair?
No, I don't think you're being unfair. You know, I think Bernie Sanders, I have to give him credit in the sense that with the issues of Cuba and Nicaragua and the sort of red baiting he's gotten over that, he has pushed back in what I think is a smart way. However, he's also at the same time, you could say kind of Russia-gated himself. You know, he's basically agreeing with what we know was a big hoax, was a big grift. This whole Russiagate scandal that we've been talking about for 3 years of Russian collusion with Donald Trump that never actually happened. And he's been playing along with it, and he's continued to play along with it even as it's being used against him by his rivals and by U.S. intelligence agencies. I think it's extremely unwise to continue to play, you know, this kind of game of, yeah, you know, I'm against the Russians helping me, because he's validating an entire narrative that is being weaponized against him and his supporters, and it's only going to get worse. And it's really important he mentioned Jeremy Corbyn, because Jeremy Corbyn, when it came to the anti-Semitism, you know, the false anti-Semitism accusations in the UK, he showed his weakness when he, you know, didn't push back hard enough against it, and he threw a lot of his supporters who were being accused of it under the bus in many ways. And I fear that that is how Russiagate is going to be used against Bernie Sanders.
Well, that's exactly right, and you've obviously followed it. That's exactly what happened. And we have a saying in Glasgow that if you don't run, they can't chase you. They'll still attack you, but you're not running. At least you're facing them and have a better chance of repelling the attack. Corbyn chose the runaway option, and apart from being decidedly unattractive, it doesn't even work. If it were successful, then Bernie might be right in following it. But it's unlikely in the extreme to be successful. Instead of saying, this is a hoax, this whole Russia thing, you know, they're trying to stop you supporting me by waving this imaginary Russian bear in front of the discussion. But it's all a hoax. And here are the reasons why it's a hoax. Instead of doing that, he has, as it were, as you just put it, bought into it. And it's not going to go away. It's not going to stop just because he has conceded that ground. It doesn't mean they're going to be satisfied. Now, let's move on to the possibilities on Tuesday. How does Super Tuesday look to you?
I mean, Super Tuesday is looking like a day that Bernie Sanders is going to sweep. All of the polls are showing him ahead in many of the Super Tuesday states. In some states, he's ahead by double digits. So it's going to be a really, really good day for him. The problem, though, is it's very exciting to see Bernie Sanders doing so well, is the Democratic Party is playing this game where they're running so many candidates in an effort to try and take votes away from Bernie Sanders so that he's never able to meet the threshold of over 50% that's necessary when going to the convention to get the nomination. At the convention, unless you have as a candidate over 50% of the delegates, then it goes to what's called a second ballot when what we call super delegates, who are like unelected delegates that the party picks, who are all, of course, pro-corporate and pro-Clinton and pro-Obama and pro-Biden, these people get to decide who the nominee is. And because there's like 10 people in the race, it's impossible for anyone to win over 50% of the delegates. So even if Bernie Sanders comes in winning 40%, which would be a huge plurality, the Democratic Party can, and I predict will, steal the nomination from him. And I think that is a conversation that Sanders and his surrogates and people who support him need to start having now, is what are you going to do when this nomination is stolen from Sanders? You can't just wait until it happens and hope for the best.
But if they do that, Rania, they are effectively handing the election to Trump, because such grand larceny of democracy is going to so demotivate and demobilize the millions that have mobilized for Bernie Sanders, that it's exceedingly unlikely, surely, that they're going to go out in November and vote for, I don't know, Bloomberg or Biden. That would be ridiculous. I certainly wouldn't.
Oh, absolutely. They know this, though. I mean, you see these Democratic Party elites are openly saying it. They're openly talking about how they don't want Sanders to have the nomination, even if it means risking the destruction of their own party. Because at the end of the day, when you think about it, Trump, he might be this obnoxious, buffoon to these people, but he doesn't actually threaten their standing. He doesn't actually threaten their power. Bernie Sanders does. Bernie Sanders actually threatens the power that the people who run the Democratic Party hold. He threatens raising their taxes. It's not something Trump's ever going to do. So a lot of these people would be perfectly happy spending another 4 years being in their fake opposition to Trump. It's been really great for them the last 3 years. They've actually made tons of money off of playing opposition to Trump. They'd be perfectly fine with doing that for another 4 years if it means keeping Bernie Sanders away from the White House. Because at the end of the day, Bernie Sanders actually means what he's saying. He actually stands for something, and he actually poses a danger to their bottom line in a way that Trump just does not.
Perfectly expressed. Now, I've asked other people this. They all say no. But it seems to me that if they steal this from Sanders, he literally has nothing to lose by standing as a third-party candidate, as an independent, by mobilizing the mass that he has now organized for a good purpose. He might win, he might not win, he might break this Clintonite power in the Democratic Party. He might come second, the Democrats might come third with their candidate. In other words, he'd be reshaping American politics. Why do you think he won't do that, or do you think he might? I
don't think he would. I don't think Bernie Sanders would. I think it's he doesn't want to be remembered, because what would happen is he would be remembered as the guy who lost the election for the Democrats to Trump. That's the narrative that would get spun in U.S. media. And I don't think that's what Bernie Sanders wants to be remembered for. I also, I think Sanders made a mistake in saying that he'll vote, or he'll get behind and get his supporters to get behind whatever Democrat is the nominee. I don't think he should have said that, especially now that it's clear that it might be someone like Michael Bloomberg. So the fact that he said that suggests
it's absurd.
that, yeah.
How could Bernie Sanders go out campaigning for Michael Bloomberg and expect his young and radical and progressive supporters to do the same? It's a joke.
Absolutely. And, Bloomberg stands against everything Sanders is for. He's a billionaire who's literally buying the Democratic Party and buying his ways into the poll, has bought his way onto the debate stage, has bought influence around the entire country. I can't imagine Bernie Sanders I can't even see Bernie Sanders getting behind Michael Bloomberg. But the fact is that Bernie Sanders has said he will support whoever is the nominee. And I think that was a huge mistake, because, Bernie Sanders clearly is the front runner. He's clearly going to win the plurality of delegates. So his narrative and his talking points moving forward should be, let's wait and see who wins first, because I want the person who gets the most votes to win. As for his supporters, I don't see any possibility of Bernie Sanders supporters getting behind another Democratic candidate, just so the Democrats can win if they steal it from Bernie. That would be a huge slap in the face to all of his supporters, and a huge slap in the face to democracy and all of the hard work these people have done, all of the money they've donated and their time they've donated to getting this man elected and into moving this movement of his forward.
Now, lastly, Rania, because I've got you here and you know a lot about the Middle East, how will this impact on the American elections if the situation in Syria begins to seriously deteriorate, as it has shown signs of doing over the last 24, 48 hours? If there's all-out war between a NATO country, Turkey, and Syria, backed by Russia and other allies, that's going to be a frightening, very frightening backdrop to the US elections. How is it likely to impact the contest?
It's funny. I don't know that it will. It's what's happening. You're right. Is very alarming. It's very dangerous. This escalation between Turkey and Russia and the Syrians, and it could explode into something even far more dangerous. But at this moment in time, you don't really hear much from the U.S. Candidates. You don't hear much from U.S. officials. It's in the last debate, they didn't even talk about foreign policy. It's like it's not on their radar, which is often the case in the U.S. So I'm not sure how what's happening in Syria would impact the election necessarily, because their foreign policy just hasn't been an issue of debate, which is really, says a lot about the U.S. and its elections. But that said, I think moving forward with Syria, it'll be interesting to see if it does escalate between Turkey and Russia. They're supposed to be talking sometime this week to try and de-escalate the situation. I don't think, even though Turkey is kind of going nuts right now, I don't think they actually want any sort of war with the Russians. That would be insane on their part. Certainly the Russians wouldn't want that, but we have to wait and see. And for now, in the meantime, the people who suffer are the Syrians. The government side in Syria is taking on high casualties, and Turkey is just wreaking havoc and bombing left and right, and basically fighting on the side of Al-Qaeda's former affiliate in Syria. They're fighting on the side of jihadist groups against the Syrian army. And the only person, again, who said anything about this, who's running for president, is Tulsi Gabbard. That's the only person. No one else is talking about it. And I think that's one of the reasons she's been able to gain such a large and such a large and diverse following, is because there's such a hunger and an appetite to hear the candidates talk about things like what's happening in Syria. But unfortunately, from the front runners, you're just not going to hear it.
Now, has Mike Pence kept you safe from the coronavirus?
I think Mike Pence is probably praying away the coronavirus.
It was an extraordinary pick by President Trump, a man who more or less denies the existence of science, is now in charge of what might be a really big threat.
No, it's extremely alarming, and I actually think that the U.S., at least the government, doesn't seem to be prepared at all for it. I don't think they've prepared the public for it. The spread of this virus is coming to the U.S. It's already there. I'm sure thousands of people already have it, and they just don't even know yet. Things are going to be shut down. It's going to impact mostly the economy. The economy is going to be, damaged by this. They're talking about a potential global recession. And so far, it's really, really alarming to watch this administration deal with this issue when they've cut so much funding. And, also in the U.S., you have good health care for people who can afford it, and you have good health infrastructure. But the fact that so many people can't afford to go to the doctor, and so many people don't even get time off work when they're sick, I think is going to pose a serious risk in the U.S. The lack of a social safety net, the lack of paid sick days. People are going to go to work sick, and they're going to spread this virus. People are going to just stay at home or just, keep doing what they're doing instead of going to the doctor because they can't afford thousands of dollars in medical bills, even if they have health insurance. So I think you're going to see the lack of social programs in the U.S. play out in the way the coronavirus outbreak happens in a really, really negative way. And it actually scares me, to be quite honest.
Wow, what a guest. Rania Khalek, why have we waited so long to meet each other? Thank you very much indeed for joining us. 54% of you think we are overreacting, and 46% say, as I do, that we are not. So get your votes in. It's difficult not to react, whether overreacting or not, to the scenes that we're seeing, certainly on social media, of mass murder in Delhi. The videos that I have seen, and wish I hadn't, include watching people literally being burned to death in their homes, and people being stoned to death by huge mobs. It is utterly horrific. It is a pogrom which is taking place. But very few people understand what it's about, what are the reasons behind it. But my next guest, Nayanima Basu, as the diplomacy editor at The Print in India, in Delhi, surely does. And I'm glad to say she joins us now. Nayanima, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Kindly explain what happened and what the situation is now.
Well, as you have, just mentioned, it was literally a fire that was burning in Delhi, right in the capital city, at a time when a VVIP was visiting India, US President Donald Trump. And it unfolded from the very first day that he landed in India. When he was in the state of Gujarat on Monday, that's when, from Monday afternoon, the fire started burning. There was this frenzied mob that had, torched houses, shops, vehicles. A petrol pump was, burned down. People were trapped inside their houses when they were sort of burned down. So, it was a chaotic, a riot that was going on, and then that continued even the following day on Tuesday when President Trump was to meet for a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and we've seen that although. It seems that it is a kind of a pogrom. Both the Muslim and the Hindu communities, both members of the community have suffered it majorly. This is just for your understanding, in the northeastern of Delhi, it had taken place, which is where mostly the working class, whose daily livelihood depend on their shops or the kind of, daily jobs that they do. It depends on them. So, their houses are burned, their shops are burned. They really have nothing to go to, and they're right, on the streets with their families. And if you speak to the people there, if you go to the ground, you will see them telling very clearly that, this has been act of outsiders who came, as a pre-planned, kind of a program that they had to do with the kind of riots that they had carried out. None of them are ready to say that it happened within the community, within the localities that they live in. And they were very clear of the fact that, these were outsiders who had the plan to carry it out. They did it for good 2 days, while the police, sort of the Delhi police just watched it. That is not to say that the Delhi police, some of their personals were not hit, but then, the political leaders, both from the central government and the state government, as well as the police, were, sort of handing gloves in this situation.
Well, yes, that's one of the more disturbing features. We've all seen, although at least those of us on social media have seen, the police standing by and watching this happening, and thus being jointly, severally culpable for the crimes. Who would these outsiders be? Somebody must know who they are. What were the slogans that they were raising? What was, do you think, the purpose of this pogrom?
So the purpose clearly was to divide the society forever, and also to bring the danger, the fear of riots and communal violence right in the, and strike it right at the heart of the capital city of this big country. Now, Delhi has never really seen communal riots to this extent for years now, apart from the Sikh riots that had happened in 1984. But then the trigger for that was something completely different. This time, there was no trigger. So these people, these outsiders, they definitely came in acting as they are this Hindu mob. They were chanting, Hindu religious lines, and they were going on rampaging any and everyone that came in their way. So. And this has been following a pattern. If you follow what had happened, earlier in Muzaffarnagar in Uttar Pradesh, there was this kind of trend that is going on where the riot has come in. They do kill people, but then killing is not their only motive. Their motive is to also loot, to sort of, strip them of their wealth, whatever they have, burn down the houses so that these people are right on the streets. They have nothing to do but then, almost turn beggars or, be at the mercy of the government. So this is a trend that is sort of happening in India for the past two communal riots, one can see. And definitely the only purpose is to divide the society forever on the religious lines, that you're a Hindu and you're a Muslim, and that is how you should be, treating each other.
Now, Prime Minister Modi has history in this regard, of course. He was found to be, or thought to be, so culpable for similar pogroms in Gujarat that he was banned, whilst the Chief Minister in Gujarat, from travelling to Britain, from travelling even to the United States. He is suspect number one, isn't he?
Well, a lot of finger is definitely being targeted at him because he has this past track record of, watching things silently even as the city sort of burns down. And which is why a lot of questions are being raised at this point of time. A lot of fingers are being raised at him. So which is why this is the time really for him to come out and state that, he's there for people and the fact that he will ensure that this never happens. However, all that we've seen in terms of response from him was a small little tweet that he had tweeted out, asking for peace, but that's about it. We also saw the Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah, who's been who did not talk about it at all. I mean, today he was addressing a rally in another part of the country in Kolkata, where he mentioned everything, but did not mention a word about what had happened. You lost 42 citizens in this 2-3 days of riot, which was huge considering the time period within which these people lost their lives. And there are more number of bodies that are coming out from the nearby, the drains and the open sewage system that you have. All these bloated bodies are coming up. Nobody knows the real count actually. this is a situation where the government is probably taking things very lightly. We've seen how the Delhi police is now, put things under control. The Prime Minister Modi also ensured that the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval come down to the street and calm people down. But it was really a case of too little and too late.
Now, what would be, you see, one of the things I was amazed about President Trump's visit is that Prime Minister Modi took him to the house of Mr. Gandhi. But of course, it was the intellectual, ideological antecedents of Modi that murdered Mr. Gandhi. It was these very RSS Hindu fanatics that murdered Mr. Gandhi. And yet there was Modi showing President Trump around his very humble cottage.
That's right, and that is something Prime Minister Modi has been doing with other state, head of states also. He did that when Chinese President Xi Jinping was here. So that has been a normal practice to tell the world that, how India practices nonviolence. However, in practice, we've seen things have become hugely different. India is now immense polarization, and that has started particularly under this government. Is not to say that it has not happened before, but it has definitely sort of accentuated at this point of time. Since coming to power in 2014, we saw how an innocent person like Mr. Akhlaq was murdered for something that he was eating in his dinner, and it was a mere suspicion that whether he was having mutton or beef, which is why and for that he was mob lynched and he was brutally murdered. And we've seen how those murderers were later rewarded. So incidents like this have been happening, which has resulted in a lot of piled up anger within the Muslim community also. It is not just the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act, which was the immediate trigger for these riots. But then within the Muslim community, there is a lot of pent up anger that is sort of simmering at this point of time.
You see, for those of us, and I think any sane person who admires and respects India, its size, its scale, its multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious character. These are extremely troubling times, aren't they? Because there's the grave deterioration of the situation in Kashmir. There's increased repression against Sikh people in the Punjab. Some of them seek more home rule within India, and now this, a new axis or an old axis being reopened, the Hindu-Muslim conflict. It makes you worry about the future of India, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly does, and it also concerns a lot of the youth of this country who are now witnessing, with a following a growth rate that is falling every single day. We've seen that the GDP rate, which is the gross domestic product, basically the growth rate of India is not growing. There are no jobs happening, no policy reforms are taking place. And so you have this bunch of youth who are educated, but they don't have jobs. So the future is definitely for them is very bleak. And then you see the kind of crackdown that is happening on university students. For students who are, who probably would have some kind of dissenting voice, they are being silenced. So the future of this country really looks bleak if it continues to go in this pattern. A lot of time the government has stated that issues like Kashmir and CAA, they are internal matters. But even if they are internal, they are creating a lot of internal disturbance, which will be creating a lot of, far-reaching impacts that will have, which probably will take a lot of time for India to sort of get those wounds healed. Also, in terms of internationally, India is not really getting a good name. There are countries, several countries are questioning the kind of measures that this government has taken, because this government, remember, came on the promise that it will do economic reforms, it will overhaul the economic situation of the country, it will create jobs, it will boost the country's growth. However, none of that is really happening, which is why the youth in this country is getting hugely frustrated.
Nayanima Basu, thank you very much for providing that vivid description of the problems of incredible India. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Are we overreacting on coronavirus? It's moving in the wrong direction for me. Yes, 55%. No, 45%. You can vote on my Twitter feed. Let me take a quick break. Sue from Stafford here. I know there are other subjects tonight, but what's your opinion of how the first week of the Julian Assange hearing has gone? Sophie says, will you be talking about the Assange hearing just finished? I sincerely hope so, as it has been massively ignored. Well, not only will I'll be doing so with the master, with Craig Murray, the Honourable Craig Murray, former British ambassador, who has been producing, in my view, the best narrative, the best coverage of that first week. And I'll be doing that at precisely 8:39, so you definitely don't want to miss it. But before that, I need to talk about the developing crisis in Syria, between Syria and Turkey, between the Syrian government and the holdouts of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the province of Idlib, the crisis between Turkey, a NATO member, and Russia, a legitimate and legal participant in the attempt to wipe out this terrorist threat in Syria, an ally of the Syrian government in Damascus. It's all turned even more ugly and dangerous than it already was. And who better to speak to than Maram Susli, Syrian Girl, as she is famous throughout the world. Maram, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Sorry to have to call on you again so soon after the last time, but the situation on the ground warrants it, I think. Tell us, please, how it looks from your vantage point.
Sure thing. Well, we have Turkey, which has been invading Syria for the last couple of years. It's been invading the east and the west of the north of Syria. And at the moment, the Syrian government is trying to take back its territory, specifically Idlib province, which is not only invaded and occupied by Turkey, but also by Al-Qaeda terrorists from all over the world, and was home to not only Al-Qaeda leader al-Jolani, but ISIS leader al-Baghdadi as well. So Turkey has been trying to stop the Syrian military from taking out these terrorists that have been terrorizing the people of Idlib. And Erdogan seems to think that he's the leader of the new Ottoman Empire.
Now, not long ago, in fact, only a few months ago, the Western media were in a lather about the poor Kurds in exactly this place, and were condemning President Erdogan for moving his military forces into this area with a view of crushing the aspirations of Kurdish people there to autonomy and so on. The Kurds have been completely forgotten about, and the same critics who were condemning Turkey for its invasion are now backing Turkey. Explain.
Absolutely. It's interesting to compare. The UK Parliament actually issued a statement condemning Turkey's invasion of Syria. You had Emmanuel Macron making statements as well, asking them to pull out. And the US diplomat to Syria, William Roebuck, he actually said that Turkey's invasion was led by Islamist groups on his payroll. Now, all of that is absolutely true, but they are selective when they choose to say this. When it comes to, the Syrian military trying to take back its territory and defeat Al-Qaeda, they don't want, they support a Turkish they support Turkey invading Syria and supporting Al-Qaeda. But if it threatens the oil reserves that the US was trying to occupy in Syria, suddenly it's a problem for the UK Parliament or for the US, because that was at the end of the day what it was really all about. The oil reserves, making sure the Syrian people and the Syrian government don't get to control their own resources, and also to balkanize Syria under sectarian lines, to choose one ethnicity and make it rule over everybody else, just as the French did during the occupation of Syria after World War I. So this is just a repeat of the colonialism, and Turkey, just because it is threatened by its own Kurdish population, got in the way of that, and that was the only reason suddenly the US and the UK remembered that Turkey is supporting Islamists and invading Syria illegally, but they've now forgotten about that.
It's quite extraordinary. I know that politicians do it because a scorpion stings because it's a scorpion. What is actually more bemusing is that people who draw a big salary as journalists and commentators and academics, who obviously do know better and have some obligation to the public that pays for them, they've all forgotten about it too. Now, the violence was bowling along at a certain level, but it dramatically took an uptick when at least 33 Turkish invaders were killed. Variously, it's said by Syrian army artillery or Russian airstrikes. Which was it, first of all, and what has been Turkey's response to that?
Well, we don't actually know who it was. You know, the Russians and the Turks seem to agree that it was the Syrian military that was that could take credit for the death of 33 invaders. But it may very well be Russia, and they would like to send a message to Turkey sort of under the table by saying it wasn't us, but you know, it was obviously the Russian Air Force that was flying in the air for most of that time. And there was a lot of targeting of these convoys at that time. So unfortunately, you know, it seems that at the moment, Russia, well, once this happened, the reason this happened is that we kind of all assumed, or at least I did, in my analysis, I thought that Erdogan is at least somewhat rational, at least somewhat intelligent. Surely he wouldn't stand against Russia and Syria in Idlib and humiliate himself, because NATO is not going to back him up. And surely he wouldn't be foolish enough to go it alone, even he, given his history. And yet he's proved us wrong. He is going ahead and escalating and acting like a mad dog in the sort of political speak, you know, the mad dog doctrine. So he, perhaps, you know, Russia also wasn't expecting that from him, because since that escalation, you know, he escalated before the 33 soldiers were killed. He sent more and more soldiers into Idlib, which was nothing to do with the agreement that he signed with Russia. The Sohi agreement was signed, and Erdogan agreed that he would set up observation posts to make sure there's a continuation of the ceasefire. And during that time, he was supposed to get rid of the Al-Qaeda elements in Idlib. And of course, he didn't do that because it's impossible to do, because the vast majority of the insurgents that Turkey supports in Idlib are Al-Qaeda, so they can't get rid of them. So they were just buying time and entrenching, and they basically, the agreement's thrown out the table because it's been a year and a half. Al-Qaeda is still there, and Erdogan's no longer just observing; he's invading and killing the Syrian soldiers as well.
Now he's not just escalating in Idlib. He attacked other targets elsewhere in Syria this week. Tell us about those.
Yes, he's been attacked Queris Air Base, which is a very important air base that was survived the entire war, and he attacked it with artillery and destroyed much of it as well. And it's not only Turkey that's been doing this. Israel has also been supporting Turkey by bombing Damascus and the south of Syria at the same time, and even now doing so. And we shouldn't forget, what is Turkey at the end of the day but a NATO power, an arm of NATO? And Turkey even now produces the boots that the Israeli military wears. So in a sense, Turkey has been the shoe of Israel. They're acting as the shoe of Israel, and it's at odds really with the Turkish people and what they claim to support. And Erdogan claims to support Palestinian causes. He invited Ahed Tamimi to speak, and yet he is, allying himself with Israel, doing trade with them, providing clothing for their military. And the Turkish ultranationalists, they're not even ashamed of this. So at the end of the day, Turkey is just a pawn of the empire, the greater empire, the NATO and Israel empire.
Now, President Putin is meeting with Erdogan on the 5th later this week. What are you expecting to come out of that?
Well, that's a very good question. It depends also on the position that the Syrian and Iranian governments take. And at the moment, it seems that Syria is going all the way, and Iran hopefully will back us up there, because we haven't stopped. The Syrian government continues to shoot down Turkish drones, the same drones that attacked Syrian government soldiers. And we still have our sights on returning our territory every inch. So it's hard to imagine that Russia would be able to, stop the Syrian military from the momentum that they have, this really strong momentum that we've seen in the last few weeks, a blitzkrieg, you might say. So the question is, how will Putin talk Erdogan down and make him realize that it's only going to get worse for him from here, because he's kind of bitten off far more than he can chew. And he's trying to juggle these balls. In Libya, even, he's invading Libya. He thinks he's the new Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, as I said. And pretty soon, one of these balls are going to fall, and he's going to end up in a position he couldn't even imagine. So hopefully, Putin will show a lot of resolve in his meeting with Erdogan. At least that's what we want as Syrians.
Now, you say that Erdogan is, of course, a member, or Turkey is a member of NATO, and of course that's true. But NATO singularly declined his invitation to respond to their Article 4 maneuver. It issued some words of solidarity, but certainly has no present intention anyway of going to war with Russia. At the same time, you see, Erdogan is not much liked in the East and not much liked in the West, and doesn't seem to mind that. His action of opening the gates for thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of refugees from Turkey, Syrian refugees, but also many other refugees that are in Turkey, for which he's already been paid to stop them coming into Europe. The European Union paid him a very large sum of money to keep these refugees in Turkey. He's now opened the gates, and these people are streaming towards Greece, which has closed its border, and now there's all hell broken out on the Greek-Turkish border. What kind of maneuver is that? Who is that supposed to win the hearts and minds of?
I think in his mind, he's punishing Europe for not, or NATO for not backing him up as strongly against Russia. Article 4, as you say, as far as I understand, it should be the Turkish homeland that is attacked before NATO acts, and that hasn't happened. So he's the one who is attacking a neighboring country. And of course, realistically, NATO wants to use him to attack Russia. They don't want to put themselves in that position. Turkey's always been like the tip of the sword, with very little benefit to itself, which boggles the mind, because Erdogan had the opportunity to shift towards the east. Recently, it seemed as though he was getting more positive talks with Russia. They were negotiating peace treaties. He might have received the S-400 air defense system. And that was putting a lot of pressure on the United States to pull out of Syria and stop supporting the separatist cause of the Kurdistan, which affects Turkey as well. But he seems to have just thrown all of that away and gone back to NATO. Please help me. I want to be a part of Europe too. Just at the end of the day, he drops the East at the pin, and the West, he still continues to beg for their support and love, and they always, as usual, reject him. So, and Turkey as a whole. So when it comes to the refugees, unfortunately, he's using them as a weapon against Europe, and to their own detriment. As far as I have heard, he's sending buses of refugees to the Greek border. He's like commissioned buses to take them there and
paid
dump
for the
them.
buses. He paid for the buses,
And people are getting killed, drowning in rivers, in the cold forest. He just sort of dumped them in the woods and said, off you go, to Europe you go. So it's not really to the benefit of the Syrian or other kinds of refugees that he's opened that border. It doesn't really help. So it's not like he's a humanitarian here. He's trying to punish Europe for not backing his results, and he's painted himself, as you said, in a corner, because now the whole world is turned against him. Even the Pentagon spokesman came out and said, well, actually, the Al-Qaeda terrorists in Idlib are making life horrible for the people inside Idlib. They are shooting women for adultery. If people try to escape, they bombed their buses. The bus convoy in Fua and Kafria killed 200 civilians. They have these religious courts, and they try to control every piece of people's lives, and they behead people in the streets and cut off people's arms. I mean, it's been a nightmare. And, even though the U.S. State Department has openly said this, you have the other wing of the U.S., the Pentagon, making this statement that's obviously true, that Turkey and NATO are supporting Al-Qaeda. So it shows that Erdogan is not popular, nor in the East or the West, as you said. The only people that seem to like him right now are Israelis.
Yeah, that'll not go far. Maram Susli, thank you very much again for joining us. We've got the Honourable Craig Murray, former British ambassador, on the line on the Julian Assange story. Ambassador Murray, thanks for joining us again. You've been extremely active from early morning, queuing outside the church, at the court rather, at, I call it a fort actually, down in Woolwich, and then dashing home to write it up, then dashing to meetings to talk about it. Give us your overview of how the week was.
Just horrible and absolutely terrible. The place is, as you say, it's like a fort. It's a kind of maximum security court inside a prison. It's designed especially to keep people out so nobody can see what's happening in there. The conditions in which Julian are kept are just awful. He's continually being strip searched and cavity searched and harassed. He's not allowed to have any papers, to keep his papers in order to prepare for the next day's court hearing. In the court hearing himself, he's kept in an armoured glass box where he can't communicate instructions to his lawyers and can't properly hear what's going on. You've got a magistrate who doesn't pretend to be listening to the defence and makes no secret really of their bias. And you've got a prosecution which is making the astonishing case that he's being extradited under the US-UK extradition treaty, but that clause 4 of that treaty, which says you cannot be extradited for political offences, that clause does not apply because the treaty is not law. But the treaty is the basis of the extradition. So the arguments really are quite nonsensical. And all in all, and to see Julian, not looking well, looking distracted, looking like it's hard for him to concentrate, kept in terrible conditions. It was an example of the crushing power of the state. And I'm still a bit shell-shocked by all of it, to be quite honest.
Now, the whole thing is Kafkaesque, but let's go back to the first of the atrocities that you've just adumbrated there. How is it legal for someone who is in a trial not to be allowed to read papers, to take them back to their prison cell and go through them in preparation for the next day's hearing? How is that even legal?
It's not legal. I mean, it can't possibly be legal. But the difficulty is that the magistrate refuses to intervene. She says that she has no jurisdiction within the prison, so she can't tell the prison service that he has to be able to read his papers. Strangely enough, not only the defense, but the prosecution said to her that it's quite normal for her to even if she can't issue instructions, quite normal for her to request the prison to let him have his papers, but she refused to do so. I've no doubt whatsoever she's being instructed by the state as to what to do. But you've got situations where everyone who can intervene has intervened about his conditions. The United Nations have formally protested about his conditions. The Red Cross have protested. There have been behind-the-scenes protests from major world figures. And the British government simply ignores it all. It really is absolutely astonishing. And what's legal and what's illegal doesn't seem to matter. The state is going to do what it wants to do anyway.
Well, she even said she had no jurisdiction, never mind in the prison, in the court. She could not allow Julian to come out of the armoured, bulletproof glass box in which he's sitting and join his lawyers, so as better to communicate with them. And this was in defiance not just of Julian's counsel, but of the prosecution counsel.
That's very true. And in the end, the defense counsel produced all kinds of examples of the law and all kinds of previous examples of people who were allowed out of the dock and to sit with their lawyers. And incidentally, Clive Ponting contacted me to say during his trial he was allowed out of the dock and to sit with his lawyer. And Julian, of course, has been through terrible traumatic time and thus has psychiatric conditions. And the defense quoted the regulations that say it is normal for prisons with psychiatric conditions to be allowed to sit next to their lawyer. That is the guidance for what you ought to do. But still it's not allowed, because I think it's a deliberate part of the torture process, if you like. It's a deliberate part of crushing this man and trying, in effect, to kill him within jail. The court has a psychiatric report before it which says that from the official psychiatrist saying that he will not survive if they extradite him, that they believe he will succeed in killing himself. And so I think it's a deliberate instrument of torture, in effect, this glass box.
How extraordinary. I'm going to let that just sink in for a moment. The state's actions are explicable because of the kind of state that we have. A scorpion stings because it's a scorpion. What is less easy to understand and even more despicable is that Julian's fellow publishers, journalists, and broadcasters are either completely ignoring all of this, even though they must be reading your estimable blog, but they're pretending they don't know it, or in some cases, they are actively participating in the crucifixion of Julian Assange. How do you account for that?
It's astonishing, isn't it? It seems that they think if they take part in this, then it won't happen to them, because they'll be seen as being on the side of the state and therefore helping the crucifixion of a dissident publisher is not a threat to other publishers if they're not dissidents. And that's the only way I can see their psychology. And the ability of them to shut it out and simply pretend it is not happening when it's happening before the eyes of the world is astonishing. And also, this has got much more broadcast time in continental Europe than it has in the UK. Every day I've been doing interviews with mainstream news media from Germany and France and Denmark and Switzerland, who seem genuinely concerned. Here in the UK, it's simply been shut out.
What happens next, Craig?
Well, there's an adjournment now until the middle of May. Then we get into the actual evidence. And that's quite interesting, because the very first evidence that's going to be called is going to be the evidence of that he was spied on in the embassy, and in particular that his privileged legal conversations with his lawyers were spied on, and that the tapes of all that were sent to the CIA, to the American government, just trying to extradite him. And that in itself, in any normal legal proceedings, would have the proceedings chucked out instantly. If attorney-client privilege is being broken by state spying, by the state that's bringing the charges, there's no genuine judge in the UK or the US who would contemplate that for a moment. That is it's self-sufficient grounds to dismiss it. But I'm not expecting that to happen, but the evidence is going to be very interesting.
Now, well, maybe they're going for a mistrial. I mean, one reading, I appreciate it's perverse, of the sheer scale of the abusive process to date could be so that the judge will say, we can't actually proceed with this because it has been thoroughly corrupted as a process.
Well, I think that's something any reasonable judge would have already said before now, because of course the judge doesn't need to. If the judge conducting the trial is going to declare a mistrial, they don't usually get to the end of the process to do it. You do that probably by now. I mean, what people are saying to me is it seems very, very likely on all this that on appeal it would be won. At the High Court or the Supreme Court, judges aren't going to put up with this kind of thing. And I think that's probably true. I think that is probably true. But I don't think Julian would survive the 2 to 3 years in jail it would take to get that far.
Why is he in Belmarsh, Craig?
Oh, goodness. I mean, that's the fundamental question. Somebody who published, and what he published was the truth. We must always remember this. He didn't publish any lies. All he published was the truth about government crimes and corruption. And he's being treated at least on a level with, and arguably he's being treated worse than, the most hardened terrorist murderers. He's being treated as the most dangerous and violent man in the country, which very, very plainly he's not. He's not involved in any violence whatsoever. So this determination, it's a determination to kill him. I've no doubt about that. And it's because he threatened the powers that be. He was responsible for the biggest ever revelation of the ill and evil that government can do. And he's viewed by those who control the state as a major threat to them. But to see the machine acting against him in this way, and to see the apathy with which that's greeted by the vast majority of other journalists, is very scary and very disillusioning.
A butterfly crushed on a wheel, but at least that particular butterfly, Mick Jagger, had a lot of coverage, including from Mr. Rees-Mogg, who penned those words as a Times editorial. We both know Julian well, and we're both broken-hearted at his Calvary. Anything that people can do that you can say now? What can people do who are watching this, listening to it, just as upset as us? What should they do?
I think we need to get active. I do think people should. I know it's a cliche, but people should contact their members of parliament. As you know, members of parliament are actually quite sensitive to what's in their email box or their post mail, and if they get 30 or 40 people contacting them on a subject, they start to think it might be something on which hundreds of their voters might base their vote. So I do think making plain that people care is important. When we get back again, I'd like to see more people outside the prison, more people protesting to drive home the fact that this is a political charge, that this and that this is a political persecution. People don't turn up. Hundreds of people don't turn up from all over the world outside prison courts for ordinary criminals, and Julian is not an ordinary criminal. And as well, organise, put pressure on journalists and put pressure on the media.
Honourable Craig Murray, thank you very much for that update. I'm sure we'll be asking for your advice again when this case returns in May. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. China moved mountains, literally. It built hospitals in days. It moved mountains. It disinfected entire cities. It stopped people moving around. It took draconian, centrally controlled, centrally planned action and appears to have stopped the rise of the outbreak. But of course, Chinese people travel all over the world, and in any case, there's no reason necessarily to believe that this virus only ever existed in China. It's now affecting people who've never been in China nor had contact with anyone who has ever been in China. And so there's every reason to believe that as the health authorities are now beginning to realize that we are, in my view at least, not over-prepared or overreacting, but under-prepared and under-reacting. And that the difference between China's approach and our approach is, in microcosm, the difference between their form of society and ours. After all, if you were in the United States and thought you just might have the coronavirus, you'd do anything other than present. Because as soon as you present at a doctor, at a hospital, as someone who might have the coronavirus, you're looking down the barrel of a medical bill of many thousands of dollars, maybe much more even than that. But enough from me, I'm merely an enthusiastic amateur. Let's talk to our old friend, Dr. Ranjeet Brar, right on the front line, in scrubs. A man who's an expert, not just on health and the parlous state of the British Health Service, but an expert on China too. Dr. Ranjeet, thanks for joining us again.
George, thanks very much for having me with you.
Deal with this dichotomy that we've been struggling with tonight. Roughly half the people think we're overreacting, and roughly half the people think we're not overreacting. Where do you stand, and what should our approach be?
Thanks, George. It's a complex question, I think, and I haven't listened to your whole show. I'm sorry, I've been working, but I've just caught the last few minutes of the debate. And it's an area where, if you like, the medical, the political, and the economic are closely intersecting, and that makes it a difficult question to comment on with a lot of competing interests. In terms of the medical, coronaviruses are not new. We've had multiple outbreaks in the past. So it is a virus is not actually a complete life form. It basically is an infective particle which is able to hijack the reproductive mechanism, the protein synthetic mechanism of a cell in order to cause its symptoms. And it does seem that this coronavirus is more infective than the SARS virus. But on the other hand, its effects are a lot less lethal. The actual number of cases that we've seen around the world, around 80,000, 95% of those within China, mainly in the Wuhan area. And I agree with you, your last comments I heard, but China have done an amazing job. I was talking to a colleague of mine who's a virologist. He was astounded at the job. He's a British virologist. He was astounded at how well China had done managing the outbreak. Firstly, to actually recognize that it's a new pathogen that you're dealing with is not a straightforward and regular everyday occurrence. An unusual cluster of respiratory infections was seen, and China is extremely advanced both in its medical care and its immunology, and of course its genetics. So it was able to sequence this virus very quickly. So relatively simple, single-stranded RNA virus, and they have actually already come up with a medicine that they're testing, an antiviral medicine that was already on their shelf, but they found to be effective against this, and it seems to be having good results with a high safety profile. It's very early days to say. In terms of the spread outside China, it's a complex thing as well. So clearly it is spreading, and that's reflective of many things. It's reflective of the fact that we used to think of Britain as the workshop of the world. Really now China is the workshop of the world and is intimately connected in terms of its transport links and economic infrastructure with the entire world. That's, of course, put it to a degree at loggerheads with the United States, and that plays out in a number of ways: military, political, diplomatic, and economic. But it's certainly true that, you know, we should be cautious of this virus. Overall, is it a pandemic? It's interesting to see that the World Health Organization haven't declared it a pandemic, because actually the numbers, there's no strict definition of the numbers necessary to declare a pandemic. It's quite possible to declare it a cluster or a localized outbreak. There have been very few cases outside around the world. What do we know about its mortality and how dangerous it is? Well, the picture is, as I'm sure you've noted in your program, is emerging. So that it's quite a dangerous illness for an 80-year-old to get, but someone who's younger than 9 probably is asymptomatic, no one's died, and, you know, it's for them, it's really almost trivial. Where it becomes dangerous is if a large enough number of people in the population, in the world's population, get it, then even a very small mortality can result in a large number of deaths and a large strain on health infrastructure. Stop me if I'm going on too long, George.
Not at all. It's a dazzling, brilliant explanation. Let's move on, though, to that point. I made the point, maybe some might think it a cheap point, but if I were in the United States, I'd be loath to present with the symptoms of the coronavirus because I couldn't afford it. I can't afford to take time off work because nobody will pay me if I'm not at work, and I can't afford the medical bills. I'm just an ordinary Joe in the United States. I'd be scared, very scared, of getting it. In Britain, where we have a health service, at least for the moment, I'd be worried as to whether the hard-pressed NHS, where trolley medicine is becoming a norm in some places, would be able to cope with a big outbreak here.
I think that's an entirely reasonable point. So when we look at systems, of course, I mean, there's an undercurrent, a subversive undercurrent in the way that this outbreak is portrayed in the media. No credit whatsoever has been given to China for their incredible efforts. I think they've moved heaven and earth very successfully. They themselves have pointed out that a certain doctor who initially raised alarm seemed to have initially met with some resistance. That's not unusual in any system. And in fact, they've subsequently sent anti-corruption officials to ensure that no suppression of this valuable information was ever taking place. But there's a kind of grey propaganda, what used to be referred to in the old Soviet days. We used to have an information research department. George Orwell was actually a member of that, who were systematically placing negative propaganda stories against the Soviet Union in our media. I mean, they haven't gone away. That's a kind of modern existing phenomenon. But of course, Soviet Union is no longer the enemy. China is a major enemy of our country, and they're constantly going on about the subversive command and control economy and trying to say in some way that this is the fault of China. Of course, you know, diseases are as old as humanity. But there's a brilliant book, I don't know if you've read it or any of your viewers have read it, I recommend it to you if you haven't. It's called Guns, Germs and Steel by Jared Diamond. And it talks about the clash of old civilizations with new civilizations and the way in which infection actually and resistance to infection grew up with densely populated human civilization. So it's as old as really human beings inhabiting cities, living closely with livestock and other animals and vermin and parasites, and the transmission of disease backwards and forwards between the two is an age-old phenomenon. We've seen many very significant outbreaks of health problems. I suppose flu is one that is important to compare it with, and we can come back to that, and certainly we could talk about the world flu pandemic in 1918, which is an interesting analogy. But just coming back to the point about how does one prepare, care for your working class population, and the overwhelming population of every country is working class. In Britain, yes, we have an NHS. I mean, in terms of preparedness, the NHS is not well prepared for major strains upon it because we're operating at absolutely maximal capacity. Part of the PFI initiative and the constant drive to really privatise the NHS, which has come to a very advanced stage now with Simon Stevens, who is formerly actually chief executive of one of the chief executives of the International Department of United Health, a huge insurance company, has come back, and now he's actually running our NHS. I don't know how many of your viewers will be aware of that. And there's a constant drive towards privatisation. And the private finance initiative, which redeveloped our hospitals using capital essentially from banks and corporate finance, meant not only is it hugely draining of our resources in terms of the mortgage repayments, we borrowed 12 billion and we're having to repay 1992 billion. So it's a massive, it's eightfold we're having to pay back what we borrowed. So it's not been a saving, it's been a massive drain on the current financial balance, which is why every single trust in the country is actually in debt now. And that debt is being used to drive further austerity measures. And despite Boris having come to, smashing the red wall in promising to do something about the underfunding of the NHS, is saying that Brexit is going to materially benefit the NHS. He himself came out only a few weeks ago saying, well, actually, this chap Simon Stevens has, too much operational control, and Boris finds himself unable to affect the financial management of the NHS. Part of that PFI was a constant reduction. As they redeveloped every hospital, there was a reduction in the number of beds in every hospital. So that actually, while we used to have cottage hospitals where we used to have a certain amount of redundant capacity, I can tell you that every hospital in the land basically operates at full stretch all the time. It's almost like hot bedding, like as soon as one patient is out, quickly clean the bed and a new one comes in. It's not good conditions for controlling infection. It's not good conditions if there's any kind of extra stress. And it's a constant concern that I've had throughout my career for the last 5 or 10 years, certainly, of not being able to get elective surgical patients into beds because emergencies are filling those beds already. So the NHS is at a real straining point, and I don't want to panic monger, but everyone who works within the NHS will recognise that picture that I'm painting. That's a fact that no politician can speak away. So were there to be currently, I do have to say, there's like 30 cases. I think there's now been one death of a British man from a cruise ship. You can't call that a pandemic compared to almost any other disease that we're talking about. And we mustn't forget that flu, when we talk about just straightforward influenza, affects hundreds of millions of people a year, and probably from respiratory deaths alone causes 500,000 deaths worldwide, and total deaths, probably 1 million deaths worldwide. So absolutely dwarfs currently the SARS pandemic. And it's in that respect that I think a lot of your viewers will say there's an overreaction the way it's being portrayed. But in terms of our preparedness to deal with any kind of extra strain on the NHS, I agree with you. There are real issues with the ability of the NHS currently to cope.
Dr. Ranjeet, thank you for that really brilliant tour de force on the political, medical and economic issues that are thrown up by this potential crisis, not yet a pandemic, but of course there are other countries which started out with 30 cases and now they have hundreds of cases, and one or two of them thousands of cases. Is there anything that we should be doing that we can tell our viewers and listeners tonight? I was alarmed as a man over 60 who goes to football matches to be told that people over 60 should avoid big crowds. Maybe I should go and watch Manchester City. There's never much of a crowd there. But I support someone else. And I'm amongst big crowds all the time. Should we be avoiding crowds? Should football be being cancelled and so on?
I think it's a really good question. I think the high-risk areas are, you know, the London Tube is going to be a hotspot should we come to a generalised infection. It's a hotspot for getting flu. I mean, people in London who use the tube will recognise that they catch flu on the tube. They're used to people sneezing in the densely packed trains in the morning. And of course, you know, this is a virus which basically is spread by airborne droplets from coughing and sneezing. I won't go into why that is, but essentially there's an ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme receptor on it, which localizes and makes it able to penetrate the endothelial lining of the lungs. So it is an extremely infectious agent, there's no question. So yeah, if it were to become generalized, yes, it's reasonable to avoid crowds. Right now, I guess airline travel would be, you know, a place where you're likely to catch it. I myself and my wife's from China, we were due to go on a long break over Easter and see her family in Hong Kong. She has elderly relatives. We, despite thinking that the chances of catching it overall are low given the numbers, are concerned we don't want to be the ones who are spreading that vector to an elderly population. While we'll be safe, our children will be safe. That's precisely the danger in that. At the moment, we can't be absolutely sure how far this will spread because the majority of young and middle-aged people who catch it will be almost totally asymptomatic. So there are dangers of spreading it. Yes, the danger is in the crowd. But I must emphasize, at the moment, there are relatively small numbers. And compared to other health emergencies, you know, I think China's done a fantastic job of limiting it. It is obviously up to other countries to intercede. And I understand why, you know, Dr. Ghebreyesus, the leader of the World Health Organization, would be particularly worried about less developed countries because where they don't have the ability to test, they don't have many medical facilities, and the population are more immunosuppressed, they're at higher risk. And probably that's the reason that there were massive pandemics. For example, the world influenza outbreak in 1918 killed between 50 and 100 million people. But that, of course, came on the heels.
It killed more people than the war.
It did, but of course it came on the heels of the war, which meant that soldiers were moving all over the world. Soldiers and the general population were malnourished and therefore immunosuppressed. And for that reason, it was a consequence not just of the pathogen itself, but the complex way in which that interacts with society. And when society is poor and depressed, and, you know, there's a world crisis now, and they may say that the economic crisis was over. In fact, they're saying it's being reignited and saying that this virus is the outbreak. If one virus is enough to precipitate world economic crisis, it tells you something about the precarious state of the economy. So it's a slightly more complex phenomenon than that. But of course, these things can spread rapidly around the world.
Well, look, I'll tell you what. I've listened to Mike Hancock today, and I've listened to Dr. Ranjeet Brar, and I wish the latter was the health secretary, but don't comment on that, because I don't want to put you in any trouble. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Let's take Ian in Hounslow. Go ahead, Ian.
Hello, George.
Nice to hear from you.
Yeah, good to speak to you. Now, you were talking about Syria earlier in the show. I don't know whether you've noticed, but the mainstream neoliberal media has gone into overdrive on propaganda against the Syrian Arab army, as it's on the verge of basically purging the republic of these Islamists. And they're claiming they're Syrian rebels. But you and I, George, know they're not even Syrians. They're from everywhere else except
China.
Syria.
They're from everywhere except Syria.
Exactly.
They're from Xinjiang in China. They're from Chechnya in Russia. They're from Saudi Arabia. They're from Wales and England, from Stockholm and Paris. Hardly any of them are Syrian. They don't even speak Arabic.
The only Syrians are those being held hostage, being used as human shields against the Syrian Arab Army of Liberation.
You're absolutely correct. And every journalist writing it knows it, Ian. They know this. They know they're not rebels. They know they're ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They know they're not Syrian. They're Chinese and Russian, Pakistani, Bengali. from everywhere except Syria. They know that. They're deliberately deceiving their viewers and their readers, deliberately.
Now, some very august and senior people have talked about the Duma hoax, and that's what they've called it. And I'm talking about the Syrian BBC producer, Rami Delati, Lord West, the former First Sea Lord, a retired UK Major General John Shaw, Colonel Wilkinson, US Armed Forces Chief of Staff for Powell, David Stockman, the economic advisor to Reagan, Sir Peter Ford, the UK ambassador for Syria. All say it's a hoax, but it's not being reported.
And don't forget the redoubtable, the dreadnought, Peter Hitchens in the of the Daily Mail. He's fought a single-handed battle for the truth about Duma, and his scars are plenty for having done it, and now he's being vindicated. Ian, I need to press on. There's a poll. You've only got 15 minutes. I need you to vote right now. What will Boris Johnson's next child be called? A, Winston. I'd vote for that one. If it's a boy, it'll be Winston. Trust me. 52%. B, Margaret. If it's a girl, it'll be Margaret. 19%. Or C, your choice. So I need you to vote now, quickly, on my Twitter feed. What will Boris Johnson's child be called? A, Winston. B, Margaret. C, your choice. Let me know. And let me take a call now from Stuart in Kansas. Go ahead, Stuart.
Howdy. So, George, I was a big fan, by the way. I was looking on the Twitter trends in the United States this morning when I first woke up, and the first trend I saw was drop out Bernie. And I understand he didn't win South Carolina, and I kept looking into it. There was no, major incident, This was trending for no reason. Nothing really provoked this. And then I was looking around, and I found an article, I forgot where. And by the way, dropout Bernie is still in the United States the seventh trending thing.
Wow.
But I was seeing how the Michael Bloomberg campaign has been hiring people on social media to post in favor of him. And it just got me thinking, do you think the billionaires in the United States and the capitalist class can be manipulating these
I'm
social
absolutely
media?
certain he has paid thousands of people to punt him, influencers they're called, on social media. I think there is no trick to which Mr. Bloomberg will not stoop. And moreover, if Bernie is the nominee for the Democratic Party, I think that Bloomberg will run against him as an independent candidate, as a third-party candidate. So get used to that one also. Stuart, nobody expected Bernie to win South Carolina. I certainly didn't expect Joe Biden to get 49% of the vote. I'm suspicious of it, I've got to tell you. But the Super Tuesday polls for Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, Bernie is miles ahead of everyone else. So why would there be a trending hashtag drop out Bernie? He's going to win.
Exactly.
He's going to win lock, stock, and barrel on Tuesday.
And listen, George, in Kansas, my job or my old job is I used to register people to vote. And a lot of those people were older Hispanic people, older black people. And lots of these older black voters, they may not be Bernie voters. Most old voters aren't in the United States. But I, at least me personally, when I was registering older black voters here in Kansas, and in my city, we have a pretty large black population, especially in the neighborhoods that I work in.
I've given a speech in Kansas City.
I'm in Wichita, not Kansas City.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Wichita. You're the Wichita lineman. Okay, Stuart, don't be a stranger.
Sanders, not Bernie Sanders.
Don't be a stranger. Do call back. I need to take more calls. I've only got 10 minutes. Tess is in Wales. Go ahead, Tess.
Hi, George. How you doing?
Good, thank you. Nice to hear from you. What would you like to say?
Just same as your last call, listening to Rania earlier on. This is all quite depressing. It seems to me that we can see Bernie getting cheated a mile off, right? So if that happens, the world is crazy. I can't cope. We've got Assange. We've got India, we've got everything that's going on. How do we deal with this? What do we do? How do we make this better?
Well, I wish I knew. I wish I could. The first thing we have to do is properly analyze everything that you are seeing and talking about, to properly characterize what's at work here, who's at work here, in whose interests things are happening. So you have to, the ontology is important, the proper characterization of all these forces that are working in the world. We need to build an alternative media to the media that is misleading people. And you're part of that. This show is part of that. Everyone watching or listening to this show is part of that. You've got to win new people to come and hear and watch it so that they too can understand things better. We need to spread our analysis, spread our agitation, spread our education. We need more conscious people if we're going to find our way out of this. Thanks for that, Tess. Breaking news. We've just heard from Sputnik News that 2 missiles have been fired in Baghdad in the last few minutes, and they appear to have come down on the US embassy in the city. What should Boris Johnson's child be called? He'll possibly call it once a month. Paul Cox says Don Johnson. Tess Delaney calls it distraction. Baron Ortega calls it Krang the Merciless. Ben's HD calls it Blair. Mr. Bojangles, Winston, girl or boy. End debt slavery, says Chump, Churchill and Trump. And David Frivolny says, I'd rather not answer, as perhaps the offspring of some American-born prime minister is not my business. However, given his infatuation with Churchill, it would not shock me to hear Winston's name is the one he chooses. I remember the deaths caused by Churchill in the First World War, says David. I think it will be Winston if he wins. If it's a boy, I'm getting tired. And I think it'll be Margaret if it's a girl. Brilliantly chosen, whoever did that poll. What will Boris Johnson's child be called? A, Winston. B, Margaret. C, your choice. Let's hear from Alex in California. Go ahead, Alex.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Alex. I am from California, and I am a member of the Party of Communist USA. And I'm here to speak about one thing I've been critical of when it comes to your show is I'm kind of critical of your support of Bernie Sanders. I'm not a neoliberal. I am not a neoliberal. I am critical of Sanders because of his support for the Democratic Party and his support for a party that is clearly anti-working class. Like, you're lucky, you are lucky that you have a party in England that at least claims to support the working class. Like, the Democrats don't even claim to support the working class.
Yeah, go on.
So that is my comment.
Yeah, well, best of luck in finding a different show that is more to your Party of Communist taste. That's all I've got to say to you, because I've got more sensible people to talk to. And she's a legend. It's Norma in Bristol. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, George. I actually am just going to say very quickly that I've learned so much from your programs, and I'm 82 on Wednesday.
Wow, 82, wow.
And thank you for the inclusion and respect you've given me over the last few years. It's made me feel part of the community, and followed by my interesting Twitter account and my supporters. So really, I want to say I'm happy to feel that MOATS there's no ageism in MOATS, and that's it today.
Definitely not, although we'd no idea you were 82. You sound far too sprightly. I hope I'm as sprightly as you when I'm 82. How's your husband, by the way?
He's all right, yes, he's all right.
He's up and about. Is he taking you out for your 82nd?
Yeah, we're going to a very smart restaurant for lunch, and then my sons are coming over for tea, And, oh, yes, we can't walk very well. I've got to stop coughing, George. But we should take a taxi and enjoy ourselves.
And you're not still, you're Fagash Flo on Twitter. I know because I follow you. Are you still smoking?
Yeah, 66 years now.
Oh dear. The doctors will.
It's bad. It's really bad.
Yeah. And you're 82. You've been smoking for 66 years, and you're one of the brightest contributors to the mother of all talk shows, which is a university. So all I can say on behalf, I think, of all of the listeners and all of the viewers, is to wish you the happiest of birthdays this week for your 82nd, and to wish you many happy returns. And you must tell me that you will call the show every Sunday, because we need your wisdom. We absolutely we need your wisdom and a little bit of humor that you bring to the show also. Everyone, follow her. Follow Norma on Twitter. Fagash Flo. It's a great name. Absolutely brilliant name. Just a time for a couple of reads. I see Erdogan is again weaponizing migrants, threatening the EU with another wave. This after the EU paid him €6 billion to house them on the border. Erdogan is an Islamist and wants a new Ottoman Empire. That's from Tony. Charlene in West Belfast says, I can't understand how these British and American liberal lovies still support Erdogan's proxies like HTS and Daesh. I, like so many others, have seen the horrific videos they produce where they torture and behead Syrian soldiers and civilians, even eating the entrails of these slain human beings. Great show as always. Thank you, Charlene, for a beautiful message. Zona, on the other hand, says, any chance Galloway can get some opposing views on his laughably called university, instead of crawling up Putin's propaganda arse where no reasonable person takes seriously. Thanks for watching, Zona. George, it's a strain of the flu. Take care. Don't panic, says Kevin. And Dave from South Wales says, you've made some great speeches in the past, but your speech on Tuesday night in defence of Julian Assange was nothing short of brilliant. Well done. Shame on our so-called mainstream media for their silence, or should I say cowardice. That's from Dave in South Wales. Dave, thank you very much for that. It's always better if you speak from the heart. Julian Assange is a very important person to me. I believe he's a world historic figure. He will be remembered long after the rats, vermin that have tried to destroy him are forgotten. Julian Assange is the most important political prisoner on the planet, and I will give, if necessary, my last breath to calling out those unjustly imprisoning him. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you, and if it was, tell another listener, another viewer. Come back next week, same time.